Um, Before Klingon, what I focused on was California Indian languages primarily, American Indian languages, mostly from the West Coast, but California in particular. And among those was a language family called Olonian. And the thing that made me think of something is one of those things was represented there, which is almost impossible, and I'll tell you why. And among those, one language in particular, which is called Woodson, which is from this, like we said, from the Central California coast, south of San Francisco a little bit, and inland a little bit. When the Europeans first came to California, there was probably 2,700 speakers of this Woodson language. In 1930, the last fluent speaker died. So it's not a language that's endangered. It's a language that's gone. At first, there was some interest in the language, and the language was still being spoken by a lot of people, which means in the early 1800s. There was one missionary in particular who wrote a grammar of the language and a phrasebook of the language. So there was something, and then no interest at all for 100 years. And at that point, in that 100 years, virtually everybody who knew the language was gone, other than people who knew a few words here and there. There was an anthropologist from the Smithsonian Institution named John Peabody Harrington, which is a wonderful name, who worked with the last speaker of this Woodson language, writing things down, looking back at what the missionary had done, trying to set it right, and so on and so forth. And after she died, the last speaker, her name was Ascension Solarzano, and after she died in 1930, then not much happened with it, not to toot any horns until I came along. A little bit had been done. I'm not the only one. And what I did was go through a lot of these Harrington notes and some of these missionary notes and some other things and try to make sense out of all this. And I was doing not linguistic field work. With linguistic field work, you sit down with a speaker of something or other and ask that person, how do you say this and how do you say that? And on the basis of the answers, hopefully, you can build up a picture of how this language works. I was doing more detective work or archaeological work because I had no control over what was in these notes or what would happen when I turned the paper to the next page or something like that. So I got a very sketchy version of what this language was all about, but enough to put together a grammatical description. It's well, it's more than a sketch, but less than a full grammar because, again, I couldn't answer all the questions because the answers weren't there in the notes. Nevertheless, at the time I was doing this, as I say, the language was, we're using the terms lost and found, the language was basically lost. The people were not lost. The people were still around. Nobody remembered any of the language other than maybe a word or two. And I was kind of putting it together. What happened after I did it, not immediately after I did it, but sometime after I did it, is a couple generations after the last speakers, people suddenly got interested again. And because of what this guy Harrington had done, and because of what that missionary had done, and because of what I had done, they were able to kind of put all this together. And people have now started to learn the language again, speak it again. So it's not language preservation, it's language resurrection is what went on here. And what struck me in this film we just saw is that one of the example languages was an Olonian language, which is impossible, or was impossible, 30 years ago, because nobody spoke it, and there it was, okay? The language that I studied, I'd never heard. I was just looking at all these papers and making guesses about what it might be. And I never heard the language until many, many years afterwards when actually it's because of Klingon. Everything is because of Klingon. I was invited to give a talk at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And I live in Washington, so I've been to the Library of Congress before. And if you're ever there, you should go there because the building is gorgeous. But anyway, they asked me, well, you're here. Do you want to see anything while you're here? And what do you see in a library? There's a bunch of books on a shelf. I've seen that. And I've seen the building already. However, When I was working at the Smithsonian, which is where all these Harrington papers ultimately ended up, there was a big, in addition to writing all these notes, Harrington was a technophile, and he liked the latest technology, especially if it had to do with sound recording. So he would record on whatever device was the latest gadget, whatever languages he was working on. And he worked on a lot of languages. And when he was working on this Woodson language, the Elonian languages, the latest technology available to him was Edison cylinders. You know, those, they look like toilet paper tubes, but they're made out of wax. And he recorded on those, and those ended up in literally shoe boxes at the Smithsonian. And some of them were in good shape, some of them were cracked, and once they're cracked, they're useless. Some of them had never been used, so if anyone has a machine that you can record these things on, I know where some blanks are. And some of them contained Elonian languages. But I never heard them because they were just these cylinders in a shoebox. Right at the time I was leaving the Smithsonian, they were applying for a grant to get these things transferred to tape, which was the technology at the time. If it was now, it would have been to MP3 files or something. And in typical, Washington, D.C. style, different branches of the government were vying for the opportunity to do this because then they get big budgets and things like that. And when I left, I hadn't heard which one it was, but then I heard that it was the Library of Congress, but I didn't know that for sure. So I said to them, if it's the case that these cylinders ended up being under your jurisdiction, I would love to see how they're cataloged and listen to them if I can. And it turns out it was. So they brought me to what was called the Division of American Folklife, the Library of Congress. The person in charge of it was a Trekkie. I was in. And she showed me the catalog, and the catalog contained the transcription of some of the songs, which I'd seen in these notes before. And I said, can I listen to this? She said, sure. So she set me up with a reel-to-reel tape, if you remember those, and a headset. And I'm listening to the transfer of the sound from the cylinder. And what I hear is, because that's what cylinders sound like, and then some singing. He recorded only songs in this thing, but it was the first time I heard the language. It was absolutely magic. These things were recorded in the 1930s or something like that. And I discovered that I partially guessed right and partially guessed wrong about the sounds, but I'm not convinced that I guessed wrong because the guy who was singing the songs was not a native speaker of my language. He was from over the hill, so who knows. Anyway, and then more relevant is the next time I heard the language spoken was at a talk that I gave at the University of California in Santa Cruz, because that's the area where these Woodson people live, in that part of California. And before I gave the talk, and the talk was given to the Woodson tribe. It's not called the Amam Woodson Band. It's kind of a couple of Elonian groups got together. And at the beginning of the session, a woman gave a prayer, an Indian prayer, in this Woodson language, which once again was impossible, couldn't have been done 30 years ago. And here I was hearing it, and here I was seeing it today. Now, what does this have anything to do with Klingon? Klingon began its life in 1979. There's not always you can date when a language begins. Klingon began its life in 1979 as gobbledygook in a movie called Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which I had nothing to do with because I got involved afterwards. And it got expanded and codified a few years later in the third Star Trek movie. And they kept going and growing and so forth. And what happened with it is now there's speakers, it's similar to the Navi thing. There's speakers now all over the world who are carrying on in Klingon and arguing about fine points of grammar and things like that. And there's a connection between this. I'm repeating some of the stuff that Christine said, which is fine because it all fits. There's a connection between the lost Woodson language, okay, and then the found bringing it back aspect of it. And the lost Klingon, it was lost because it wasn't invented before 1979. It's lost in a funny way. And the found Klingon language because it's still around in a number of interesting ways. One is that both of the languages are not fully known or completely known by the speakers of those languages. There's a relatively small vocabulary for both of them, or for the relatively small known vocabulary anyway, for both of them. And the grammar for both of them is incompletely described. Woodson has a small vocabulary, small known vocabulary, because there was whatever was in the notes and nothing else was. Clearly there was a lot more than what was written down. And the grammar is the same thing. Klingon is a small vocabulary and an incomplete grammar because that's my fault. Nevertheless, people are learning and using both of the languages. They're translating stories. The first translated story in Woodson that I'm aware of is Green Eggs and Ham. They're writing original stories in these languages. They're singing songs, writing songs. And they both have operas, which is the best thing. There's the Klingon opera, which is performed in it's a Dutch opera, actually. Well, it's in Klingon, but it was produced in the Netherlands. It's called which means universe. Opera entirely in Klingon. And in Woodson, I like to say there's a comparable opera. It's really a cantata. It's not an opera. And it's in English, but it's about the last speaker of the language. And it's about the fact that she's the last speaker of the language. And both of the languages have to deal with anachronism, but from two different points of view. And what I mean by that is for Woodson, there's no words, or were no words, for late 20th century, early 21st century things, like telephone, okay? Because they didn't talk about that in the 17 and 1800s, and so on. And from a Klingon point of view, there's also no word for telephone because they don't have those in the 23rd and the 24th century. Okay, but the Klingon speakers now want to be able to say things like that. So I've had to come up with all kinds of words that I thought that I would never have a need for in Klingon. You need to talk about dilithium crystals or antimatter transducers. That's not a problem. But you need to talk about everyday things. That's an issue. I've been asked a number of times over the years, why would anyone study a language that nobody speaks? And so far tonight, we've heard some good answers to that. Another answer that I would give from time to time is so that people can speak those languages. When I was doing sort of some background research for that talk I told you about in Santa Cruz, I came across on the internet, because the internet is a wonderful thing and is responsible for the spread of Klingon and all that, in the same way it is for the Na'vi. I came across a little story, a little essay written entirely in Klingon, which I'm going to read to you, a part of, not the whole thing. This was written in the mid-1990s. I don't know who wrote it, because whoever wrote it put their name in Klingon, and it's a name that I didn't recognize. I know a lot of Klingon speakers and their Klingon names. I didn't recognize this one at all. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read part of it. The name of this little piece is Klingon Chol Lach Chol Mejet, which you can understand. That means Klingon and other languages. Okay? Homecher edge port hortedge put. You following this, right? Mutzen chor port put de shov dach tob Okrand. Dach mutzen hol jach pech a jach pach. Chech pu bo chor och mutzen chor et. What all that means is linguists study and analyze languages. When he analyzed Woodson, Okrand made use of his knowledge. Nobody speaks Woodson now. Woodson is a language that's died. And this thing goes on, but I'm not going to go on in Klingon. I'll just go on in English. Someone might ask, why study a dead language or a language that few people speak? That's a stupid question. All languages are useful and important. All languages must be respected because all languages embody actual culture. This is all written in Klingon, remember. Languages resemble people. All have the same rights. But there are those who disagree. They proclaim, we are the superior ones, and they act like superior ones. They are obviously not superior. Those people can't understand the richness of the human race. I think it's pretty good that Klingons would talk about the human race. Anyway, Klingons clearly feed the spirit. Languages clearly feed the spirit, and when the spirit of a language escapes, honorable people won't be happy. When a language dies, a way of understanding life also dies, and this makes us poorer. It's true Klingon philosophy. Everything else we'll do in the circle. Thanks a lot.